Good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I'm very, very honored to be here, and I am just thrilled to be able to show up when Dr. Reed needs me to. I got this kind of frantic email. What is the title? What's the title of your talk? And I just thought, okay, I'll just throw something up there. And I threw something up there, and I don't know whether you got it, Teresa. Did you get it? Okay, I didn't know who I was sending it to. I just sent a title up. And the longer I've lived with this title, the more I like it, because I really do want to talk about difference and what difference makes. Now, the interesting thing that when Dean Reed came up with this comment about seeing where we're going, I think it's really very difficult to know where we're going unless we know where we've been. And so I want to talk a little bit about where we've been. And as mentioned, I was born and raised in Birmingham. I'm almost 70 years old. So if I tell you I finished high school in 1963, most of you can't relate, but you will at least be able to count and therefore understand, if you know anything at all about the civil rights, the history of the civil rights movement. 1963 was pivotal in the civil rights movement in Birmingham. Birmingham was the epicenter of all of this stuff that was going on, the Children's March and everything that kind of sprang from that. The bombing at 16th Street Baptist Church, all of that came. And I left Birmingham and George Washington Carver High School. We were segregated schools. And I went to the University of Washington in Seattle. Now, I don't know how many of you can imagine what Seattle and the University of Washington was like. Some of you can. It would be like going from here to Mars in terms of a different environment. It was a totally different world. And I do need to tell you that I'm kind of like one of these post-Sputnik kids that relate to science. But I went to the University of Washington as a pre-med major. Now, yeah, that's me. It's easy to, yeah. Okay, that's the 20-year-old me, all right? So I went to the University of Washington, which was very, very different from where I had been. And I went as a pre-med major, and because that was all I knew you could do with science. I mean, that was the extent of my background. I knew that science was somehow connected to medicine, so I said, okay, I'll be pre-med. So the first thing I encountered was the pre-med advisor. And the pre-med advisor said to me that essentially she'd lined out all my courses, and then she told me to come back at regular times. So when I went back after the first quarter, she said, you're never going to make it into medical school. Oh, okay. Kind of like, why? Your grades aren't good enough, okay? Heck, I had come from George Washington Carver High School, which was an under-resourced black school in Birmingham, Alabama. I thought I was doing fine. I got an A in chemistry. I mean, how many kids get an A in chemistry first term? True, I had to run like crazy to catch up and keep up, but that's what it was. But she says it was not good enough. Right? Well, why? Because they are not going to let women in at the same rate that they will let the men in. Oh, okay. So I have to be much better in order to get in with my classmates who are around me. Yeah, that's kind of the way it is. And you know, one of the things that you begin to realize is that the idea that I, as an African-American woman, is going to get into medical school, given the situation of the time, I had to be out of my mind. Because there were restrictions with regard to African-Americans getting into medical school. At that time, there were 2 historically black medical colleges, one at Howard, one at Meharry. Morehouse did not exist. So I had that going, and then I had the fact that, as well, here I am to expect that a woman cannot get in. So maybe if I had kind of known about the existence of some of my sheroes, okay, I don't know how many of you know Betty Hamburg, but Betty basically finished Yale Medical School in 1948. And if I had known about her, maybe I would have said, well, my goodness, she managed to get through the system. Or one of my other sheroes, Vivian Penn, who is absolutely amazing. She has the Office of Research on Women's Health. But Vivian was the only woman and the only African American in her medical school class at the University of Virginia when she finished in 1967. So that if I had known about them, I would have persisted, or maybe not. Sometimes I think you end up where you're supposed to be. And in my case, I made that shift between my junior and senior year from going to medical school to wanting to pursue graduate education in the sciences instead. Now, I was a faculty member, okay? And as so many women do, when you marry, you sometimes make other choices, you move, etc. In my case, my husband was exactly where he needed to be. It was a perfect fit for his background, which was in physics and computer science. So he ended up at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, developing software that controls experiments that were on satellites. He ended up exactly where he was supposed to. I felt like I was much more fungible in terms of what I could do. And so I decided that I would just look around for a job. I ended up at AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, as a research assistant, looking at programs to bring more minorities into the sciences, engineering, and medicine. I left there, went to the National Science Foundation for 2.5 years, and then came back to AAAS to head the unit, and I have been there ever since. I went back in 1979, so I've had a very long career at AAAS. So the question is, why would you stay at the same place? And the reason for that is that I found that it was a wonderful base to pursue the things that I really cared about, which was to diversify the community of which you are a part, of which we are all a part. And so I learned on the ground about policy and about the power of policy to make a difference. And I want to give you an example of this from the experience with regard to medical education. And that is the Flexner Report. How many of you have heard of the Flexner Report? Okay, everybody pretty much has heard of the Flexner Report. 1910, the Flexner Report essentially enshrined what was already a movement within medicine to increase the rigor and to bring more science into it and to do all kinds of wonderful things that essentially 10 years later, it had really transformed medical education. The process had already started, but what Flexner did was that he aligned all of the other parts. The report allowed the other parts to be aligned, such as licensing and the rules that were emerging out of AMA or AAMC or what have you, and the philanthropy component of it. And so you ended up totally transitioning because of the Flexner Report. That was a policy report supported largely out of the Carnegie Foundation. But the Flexner Report had unintended consequences. One of the unintended consequences was that we went from something like 10 black medical colleges to 3 and then to 2. Okay, so why? A lot of those colleges some of those colleges were weak. They were proprietary. But to the extent possible, they didn't have the resources to be able to regularize themselves the way that the wealthier medical schools could. But they were being held to the same standard without the resources. Okay. So there were financial stresses on the remaining institutions. The ones that did emerge from that, they had major financial burdens that were put on them in terms of bringing in laboratories and things like this, bringing in faculty who could teach in those laboratories, holding classes not at night. I mean, there were lots of regulations that came along with that. But the other part was that there were a loss of women's medical colleges, and not all of those women's medical colleges were as fragile as the black medical colleges were. But at the end, like 10 years later, you ended up with one. It was Women's College of Pennsylvania. So I tell you this because I want to impress upon you the fact that sometimes you do have unintended consequences that relate to policy. And so you kind of have to do the thought experiment. If I do this, then what happens to that? But as a consequences of losing those institutions, we lost the workforces that go along with them. You shrank the workforce and women's participation within medicine. And it stayed shrunk until the 1970s. Okay, and we also lost the participation of African Americans within the medical workforce as well. So policies make a difference, and I just wanted to put that out. Laws make a difference too. In my case, I came from a state that had legal segregation. By that, I mean this wasn't just a matter of culture. This was a matter of law. I get on the wrong part of the bus, I could be arrested. I drink from the wrong fountain, I can be arrested. I go to the wrong restroom, I can be arrested. So that this piece was in place, the Jim Crow laws. And the reason that I want to raise this was that even though many of this was not happening in the North, when the North basically went along with the South in terms of its rules and regulations, what it did was to codify in the North the things that happened. And I raised that as an example of that, the AMA, where you had very few blacks who were basically admitted into the AMA, and that was basically as a sop to the South because they didn't want the Southern states to be unhappy. Now imagine what would have happened, do that thought experiment of what might have happened if the AMA had said, well, your chapters in the South can't be members because you discriminate. Now, think about what would have happened had that been the attitude that was taken, as opposed to, we don't want to make our Southern people unhappy. So, laws make a difference, and how you respond to laws make a difference. Now, it took, after that, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that began to loosen up some of this. You began to see some movement, especially with regard to minorities and the titles that actually related to institutions that were receiving federal funds. This was a Lyndon Johnson kind of a thing. Okay, so if you're receiving federal funds, there was this, like, there are things you can't do. And discriminate on the basis of race became one of those things that you couldn't do. Now, it took Title IX in 1972 before we basically said we can't discriminate in educational institutions on the basis of sex. And we are still wrestling Title IX to the ground. But what happened with Title IX was that a lot of the laws, a lot of the practices that were in place had to be given up. So those quotas that were on women in medical school, you had to give them up. So people said, well, we never had any quotas on women. They were admitted at the percentages that they applied. The only issue was that if you didn't apply because you saw you weren't admitted, then of course your numbers are going to be low. This is kind of like circular logic that just doesn't work. So in the 70s, you started to see the percentage of women applicants go up. So this was like in the 20s, and then it became in the 30s, and then it became till today, where you have near parity in terms of applicants and admits. So it's a very different world, but remember, this is not the way it has always been. And there were legal things that had to happen in terms of making it different. Now, the reason I raise this is that in some ways we're retreating from a lot of issues. We have state referenda that say that we cannot have affirmative action, okay? And when there was a dip in the numbers of minorities in medical education, and there was in the 1990s, okay? When there was that dip, it was because of state referenda or court cases. The dip was largely due to the changes in the medical schools in California and in the Hopkins states. So we lost ground. And there have also been decisions by the courts that have caused institutions to basically become more skittish in terms of how much they are willing to reach out and what they are willing to do, because they are afraid of getting sued. Okay. So I love this title, What Would Patsy Mink Think? Because it was Patsy Mink who put in the legislation, the language that related to Title IX. This is a piece that is actually by another colleague and friend, Molly Carnes. And so I think we need to remember this. And Molly has said that in some cases, she asked young women, did they know what Title IX was? And they didn't know. And they didn't really understand where this access basically had come from. So, resources matter. Money makes a difference. You had, remember in the earlier story, these under-resourced medical schools that just couldn't meet the standards that were being put forward. And therefore, we lost those schools, even though the demand was high for having people being able to go in and serve in many of the rural and other kinds of communities. But there was also the issue of limited personal resources. These were not people who could afford medical school necessarily. Even if they had a calling, even if they had ability, they just couldn't personally afford it. But I want to tell you another side of the story with regard to resources, and this is the story of Johns Hopkins. When Hopkins wanted to add a medical school, they went looking for money so that they could start the medical school. And there were this group of women who had inherited fortunes from dead dads or husbands or something who were in Baltimore. And essentially they said, we will give you the money, but women must be admitted on an equal footing from the beginning of this medical school. All right, so he went away and tried to find the money someplace else. And he couldn't find the money. So he had to come back to these heiresses, and if you read about Mary Elizabeth Garrett, heir to the B&O Railroad fortune, read about creative philanthropy. This is a case of where he had to come back to get the money, but he had to take the conditions. And so I would like the idea of whispering in the ear of philanthropists and say, you don't have to give them this. You can put conditions on your money that you don't discriminate. There are lots of things that you can do. But I thought that this was a wonderful story. I love this story because it essentially says that you can take money and do the right thing in the same way that this did not happen at the time that these under-resourced medical schools were going around cup in hand trying to get money out of the, General Education Board and out of Carnegie and a lot of other places. Everybody agreed that Columbia needed to be supported, the Penn needed to be supported, all these other institutions needed to be supported. They did not necessarily agree that these other institutions, that these black medical schools needed to be supported, nor did they send any money in that direction. But these heiresses are my heroines. When we talk about the kinds of things that we've been talking about, they're not one-off behaviors. The inequalities are structural. And what do I mean by that? It means that everything is aligned to disadvantage, okay? Whether they're institutional admissions policies where they say, well, I'm not going to let you in because you haven't had 2 years of college, which is what really happened with regard to early medical education that transitioned. But if I'm poor and I hadn't had the opportunity to go to college, I'm not going to get into medical school, all right? So then you have these admissions policies. And then there are the issues of culture and class, you know, in terms of this very much became a class-based issue. If I could afford it, I could go in that direction. If I couldn't, forget it, all right? Then there was the AAMC and the Committee on Medical Education that was pushing in a particular direction of, I agreed that, in fact, you wanted to change medical education, and you wanted to get to a point where you had people who were well-trained basically out in the community. I had surgery in August. I am happy that my surgeon had the best training that he had. Okay, but this was a matter of the way that they pushed it and the way that these things align. The AMA basically was not allowing blacks as members. Another organization, the National Medical Association, was formed in 1895 as kind of a response to this, so that you could actually have kind of professionalism within the field. And then there was the whole issue of private philanthropy, who they did and did not support during that time. They supported retaining the structure as it was, and that's what we ended up with. And I think that unless we begin to understand that in some cases these things are very much become systemic, it is the structure that it creates, and it's almost impossible to undo that structure unless the structure itself changes in ways that push in a different direction. So the other piece of talking about what difference does difference make in medical education, shaping the practice of medicine. When the Grutter and Gratz cases from the University of Michigan were appeared before the Supreme Court, there was Justice O'Connor who brought her experience from law school as well as the research that had been done at Michigan, the very good research that had been done at Michigan, that talked about the educational value of diversity. And she, in fact, ended up putting that language into the findings, the decisions that came out of the court. But I think that it's not just a matter of that language. It is how does that language get translated into the way that we think about our work and our content. And it is incredibly appropriate to have that conversation with regard to medical education. You gain from the interactions with people who are different from you. They bring you different lenses into culture, into class, into a lot of things that are absolutely crucial with regard to the practice of medicine, into the classrooms as well as into the issue of dealing with patients. So culture matters, and you have this rich exposure and opportunity to interact with people. Now, I saw this AAMC statement on the learning environment, and I thought, okay, this is pretty good, except that diversity is not an explicit value here. And I think that's a problem. We have to begin to make these things explicit. I can't talk in code to you and have you understand. I have to tell you that race has almost always mattered in my life. Whether I wanted it to or whether I didn't want it to, it has always mattered. Now, I'm a biologist by training. I know there's no such thing biologically, but I understand that there's human variation. But in terms of the socio-cultural dealings with this society and with the laws, it's real. And so not having it as an explicit value, I think, is a problem. And I wish that I had been a part of the conversation. And that's one of the things I think that is really important, that we choose to basically be a part of committees and things like this. Yeah, one more committee. But if you're not there and there's no opportunity to talk about it and to really confront it, it will never change. Now, the interesting thing that is happening right now is the way that the science is changing. Our understanding of who we are as humans has been totally shaped by the science that is emerging. I was on PCAST, President Clinton's PCAST, when the human genome was actually announced. And it was really an amazing moment. And it was an amazing moment when President Clinton came to AAAS to sign legislation about non-discrimination on the basis of one's genomics. And this was for federal people only, which is the only thing you could do by executive order. But it was an amazing moment because you began to understand that this is opening up a whole new way for us to think about ourselves, and that this is opening up incredible doors in terms of human variation, because there it is real and it is in front of you, and you begin to understand that it makes a difference in terms of the way that medical treatment may progress. Not only the genetics, the genomics, and what else? Maybe the epigenetics. And I do think that the science is pushing us in very interesting ways, maybe to the point of being able to have really good, realistic, and honest dialogue around some of the issues that we have otherwise ducked. Now, I was really shocked to find out that this book existed. This is a report that was done by the then Institute of Medicine, National Academy of Medicine now, in 2001. Does sex matter? That's an interesting question. Does sex matter? All right, in this particular case, the conclusion was it matters a lot in terms of research. You cannot ignore that your animals are male or female, that your cells are male or female, that there is an environment, a genetic, genomic, epigenetic, whatever it is that you want, environment that basically comes from that. This article that was in Science of mice and women, the bias in animal models, I think I would urge you to go and read it. And I feel very proud of it because the two women who wrote it used to work with me. And I think that they are science journalists, but they became very interested in this notion of what is actually happening around research. We are basically using models over here that in many cases are largely male animals, and then we will basically turn around over here and apply the results to males and females. So there's something a little off about that, especially as the information is emerging, that in fact that's not a good thing necessarily to do. Sometimes you can do it, but sometimes you shouldn't. And the other part, which is the unequal treatment issues, the health disparities issues, that does difference matter. And in some cases, it does matter, not only in terms of what gets studied, but also in terms of how people are treated, what is the notion of appropriate practice in different cases. I wanted to open up, I know this has been all over the place, But I wanted you to understand it is all over the place. It matters in the structure of our policies, our laws, our practices, our education, our workforce, et cetera. And so I hope that within this morning, we can begin to explore how we can bring these pieces together in a coherent way so that the system works for diversity rather than against it. Thank you.